Elona, land of the golden sun. A land of wealth and bounty.
Guild Wars 2's second expansion, Path of Fire, is taking the player base to two new big regions that have existed in the franchise before. So this is Guild Wars 2, but in the previous game, Guild Wars 1, we had the Crystal Desert, which was a remote, inaccessible, dangerous location that we could visit for a short period in our adventure. And also in one of the other Guild Wars 1 campaigns, Nightfall, we had an entire continental-sized region known as Elona that we could travel to. Neither the Crystal Desert nor Elona have appeared in the sequel, Guild Wars 2, until now. They're both being dropped, or a lot of them, with Path of Fire, the Crystal Desert and the northern regions of Elona itself. Now, what's truly great about these regions of the world is the immense amount of lore they have associated with them. The Crystal Desert has a lot of layered, interesting, magical history, and especially the Elonan regions. I mean, this was a fully priced boxed game you could buy with a huge amount of world building and history and lore to go along with it. So here in 2017, as the player base are returning to these locations, the devs have got a bit of a job to do. It's 250 years in the future, yes, and there's a lot of new things to take in, but also there's all this story to reintroduce to people and give them interesting details about what there might be going on behind the scenes and how the story of today links in with the story of 250 years ago. So there's a lot to get through. Well, the devs are trying to help out a bit for the new players. On their official website, they've just posted a lore article which gives you all the key bullet-pointed pieces of information from the beginning of time, basically, all the way up to very recent events that happened in the most recent episodes of The Living World. And by reading this article, people can kind of get a gist of all the main stuff to know. So that's what this video is. We're going to go through this article, we're going to pick at the interesting pieces of information, and by the end of however long this is, you will know, or whoever you link this to will know exactly what they need to know to get a huge amount of enjoyment out of the new expansion and get a lot of that backstory if you've been a bit out of the loop. So let's do it. Guild Wars 2, Path of Fire, The Road to the Desert. So they open by saying, Guild Wars 2, Path of Fire returns players to the Elonian Desert region, the setting for the Guild Wars Nightfall campaign many years ago. So that was back in 2007, they released that. A decade later, we are coming back, a decade of further enhancements to the game engine and the kind of tech that the devs have available to them, the kind of graphics that we'll be experiencing, the gameplay. It's going to be really good. Exactly 10 years later, really. An ancient land of magic and majesty, the desert is where giant sandworms roamed and humans once strived for the right to commune directly with their gods. So this opening paragraph gets you the gist of what this expansion is going to be like. Lots of hot, arid, deserty, sand-dune locations. The funny thing is, there's a bit of conflation going on here, I'd say. Elona really wasn't just a desert region, it had a lot more going for it, but specifically the Crystal Desert to the north of it, the desolation areas between it and Elona, those kind of areas were very deserty, and primarily the expansion seems to be set in those. They say, but things have changed in the past 250 years, and the region that was once associated with the land of the golden sun has grown much, much darker. There they use the term golden sun. This is fantastic. People who played 10 years ago will remember that it was Elona, land of the golden sun. In fact, I think the very first voice acted dialogue for the entire campaign was exactly that line. So they go on to say the Elonian desert is currently ruled by a tyrannical undead lich named Palawa Joko, and it is beset by both the elder dragon Kraukatoric and the rogue god Balthazar. So these are the three big functions of the expansion. Three large villains all duking it out at once. Our job as we go into this expansion is to defend the Elder Dragon from the gods, while the tyrannical lich seems to be lurking in the background. They go on to say that the growing threat of a clash between God and Elder Dragon doesn't just threaten the desert, its people, and the rich cultural tapestry that they've woven. It threatens the magical balance that holds Tyria itself together. And these are all stories contemporary players of Guild Wars 2 should be pretty much caught up on. They go on to say, in its 1,000-year-plus history, the Elonian Desert has been the site of some literally world-shaping events. And indeed it has. So the thought we'll be getting a 2017 expansion with more world-shaping events here is quite thrilling. So what they're referring to there is specifically the fact that a large chunk of the desert we know of today as the Crystal Desert never used to exist at all. It was actually a shallow sea known as the Crystal Sea, but because of a conflict between gods many years past, it dried up and became what it is today. We'll get more details on that in just a second in the video. So the devs finally say, as Guild Wars 2 returns to the desert, it's important to remember how vital the desert region is, how glorious and terrible its history, and how it factors into the ebb, flow, and evolution of magic. So they give us a timeline. So we're going to rewind quite a long time, not the beginning of time as I alluded to at the start of the video, there is earlier history than this, but we're going to be rewinding to sort of the start of human history on this planet Tyria. So we go to 786 BE. So when it says BE there, what that means is before the Exodus. The Exodus was a very big moment we'll be getting to in a second, where there was a cataclysmic struggle between the gods, and this, our timeline here starts 786 years before that moment. So the gods arrive, and they brought friends. The 6 gods first appeared in Cantha in this year, bringing humanity with them. Like gardeners starting a new patch, they transplant human beings to this lush new world, working the soil and tending their seabeds to ensure the new crop will take root, spread, and thrive. So in a recent video, I talked a little bit about this. Many people aren't familiar with this fact, and it's always shocking. One of the more fun things about Guild Wars world building. Yes, it's true that the human player race and the gods associated with them, none of them are actually native to the planet the game takes place on, Tyria. They're from elsewhere in the mists. Where exactly? We don't know. Why exactly? We don't know. But to refer to the gods and the humans as alien on some fundamental level would not be wrong. This was initially some quite obscure lore, but the devs seem to have very much embraced recently, and I love every time in a contemporary setting the devs bring it up again. Yes, the gods are alien, and it could just be that in this expansion, because there is a god back on the planet now, we might finally be getting answers to stuff like this. Remember, the context for this article is the devs are trying to remind the player base of what's important to know as we go into the expansion. So there's every bit a good chance that anything they say in this article might actually be alluded to in-game at some point. So yes, there's not only the fact that they're all alien, but also that the gods appeared in a region called Cantha. Cantha is not the setting of this expansion, neither is it the setting of the game in 2012. It's actually somewhere else on the planet, even further away. Honestly, I think we're only thinking about this because the locations the expansion take place in have a lot of influence by the gods. There's a place called the Hall of Ascension, and the gods had, you know, a major impact as they warred in this region once upon a time. So that was way back. Many, many years later, about 500 years later, we get to the next point on the timeline. The year 205 BE. It's called Into the Desert. After centuries spent settling in Cantha and then in Ur, humanity expands to Elona. Despite the desert's harsh climate and a host of both magical and natural dangers, humans establish a foothold in this magically robust environment that will become one of the most durable societies in history. And so here we get to the point of the Path of Fire locations. So just so that people know, the order of the human migration stuff is quite interesting. It's very zigzaggy. We start in Cantha in the south, then we go all the way north to Ur, then we go south again to Elona, and then we actually hear that Kryta, which is 2012 Guild Wars 2 locations, Kryta was initially a colony of Elona, so then once we go to Elona, we go north again, and that perhaps explains the ethnicity of Krytans back in GW1. It explains references to lions, like at Lion's Arch and the statues, despite the fact we never see any indigenous to that region of the world, but they are indigenous to the regions of Elona. So the order would be Cantha or Elona, Kryta, and then beyond around Ascalon and so forth. Very weird zigzagging, but you must understand that this zigzagging could be a thing, because at this point, the landmass connecting Elona and Tyria, the Crystal Desert, that doesn't exist yet. Or where the gods went after Cantha, or at this point in time is potentially just an island. Or if it is connected anywhere else, it would be connected to the Elonan mainland via the Scavenger's Causeway or something, maybe a bit like this, as you can see on screen here. It would be striking against like those western mountains of Elona that were visible on the world map in 2007 in Guild Wars 1, but we never actually got to explore. That's an interesting thought that in Guild Wars 2 we might finally get those locations. So that can explain why the migration patterns were a bit odd, because if you're starting in Ur, and there's a land bridge connecting to Alona, then obviously you're going to go to Alona first before maybe sailing out north on a whim to see if you can get to a place like Kryta. But removing back to this point in the timeline, it's not a big passage of text, but there is something else quite important to look at. They say this, that despite the desert's harsh climate and a host of both magical and natural dangers, humans establish a foothold in Alona. So I'm not sure whether I like this very much. They refer to the desert's harsh climates. And as I just mentioned to you guys, the Crystal Desert, where the expansion's taking place, that doesn't exist yet. So I'm not actually sure I like this line, because any desert at this point, I guess, that we're talking about would be where? Corner, maybe? Much further south regions in Alona and other regions. But as I mentioned at the start of this video, those places aren't expressly deserty. They have lots of vegetation and varied stuff. They're more than just endless dunes. So the Desolation is another potential place they could be talking about as the desert here. It could have existed as a sort of deserty area on the southern coast of the Crystal Sea. But honestly, my impression of the Desolation at this time in history was that it too, just like the Crystal Sea, also was still a sea, maybe with a couple of islands in it, but where people might have established stuff, but little more. I was under the impression that the Desolation only became the Desolation after Abaddon's fall. Now, the Guild Wars 1 wiki does suggest that the Desolation was there and it was a coastal region, but I have absolutely no memory of where that fact may have came from, and as is quite often with lore things on the wiki, there is no citation. These pages can be very heavily editorialized and filled with people's headcanon, by the way, guys, so be aware. I'm not saying this is necessarily an exact example of that, but I wish more people did realize that the wikis are not from the words of the devs all the time. Anyway, back to the Desolation region. Even if we do accept that it existed at the time of these early settlers, I don't think it would have been a desert back then either, because in Guild Wars 1 we get a few outpost locations that talk about the spread of the desert through that region as kind of a creeping thing in the post-Abaddon Fall days. That's when the sulfur and the torment and things started traveling through that land. It spread through it. So even if it was a landmass way back then in the year 205 before the Exodus even happened, it was unlikely to have been a desert. In fact, we know that several great kingdoms and cities were eventually established there by both humans and Forgotten, like the city of Mora, the Forgotten Citadel. So, I don't know. Anyway, I'm probably getting a bit picky about the use of the word desert. Whatever. Let's go to the next bit of the timeline. Next, we have Royal Roots. It's still 200 years before the Crystal Sea would dry up. The royal line of the primeval kings begins its 650-year reign over the desert region. During that reign, one of their best and brightest, Queen Nadija, founds the Order of the Sun Spears, a heroic militia that uses magical and military might to protect the innocent and oppose any who would harm the new nation. Over the coming centuries, the Sun Spears will selflessly serve their rulers and the people, and they will come to command almost religious awe and respect from the people of the deserts. So I love that the devs are so clearly giving us a lot of information about the Sun Spears here. It's suggestive to me that maybe the expansion itself will have a lot of cool Sun Spear information in it too. The Sun Spears were badass. If you were a Guild Wars 1 player in 2007, you joined the Order of the Sun Spears. Kind of the whole pretense of why you were adventuring around the world was because you were doing it on behalf of the Sun Spears. These guys were like a unified military across all of the states. In fact, here, I'll give you guys another description of the Sun Spears from 2007. Elona doesn't have a unified government. The three provinces work side by side, but one alliance of heroes defends the entire nation. From the southern coast of Istan to the northern peaks of Vabi, peace has its price, the eternal vigilance of the Elonans who guard their nation. These valiant defenders are the Order of the Sun Spears, an elite order pledged to defend their nation against all threats, whether martial, mystical, or supernatural. So the Sun Spears, guys, in short, are old. They were founded way back when in the reign of the primeval kings, which was like a golden lost era for the Elonans. That was super deep history, and we don't know too much about, except how that era of time actually fell. The other thing to understand is around now, this is when one of the first great cities was founded in Elona, a place called Farina, and the very first primeval king actually ruled from this place. So that's where we're talking about right now, is not anywhere near the Crystal Desert, really. It's super far south on an island, which you can only just see on this Guild Wars 2 world map right here. That is where the primeval kings ruled from, a long way down to the south. So let's skip another 200 years forward, and we get to the year 0. So this is the big moment where the sea dries up. The devs describe it as such. They say the new age begins with a bang. They say Abaddon, who is one of the gods, the patron gods of humanity at that time, one of the 6. Abaddon declares war against his fellow gods over the issue of humanity's magic use. The other 5 gods band together to defeat him, and they imprison him in the realm of torment. But their victory is a very costly one. The fury of this divine clash obliterates the Crystal Sea, transforming it into the wasteland known today as the Crystal Desert. Once Abaddon is imprisoned, the Forgotten, a mysterious race of advanced snake folk who have allied with the gods, serve as Abaddon's jailers to prevent him from doing any more damage. So they go very specifically into that detail that they were Abaddon's jailers. I wonder whether that will be a thing in Path of Fire. So there's a lot to dig into here. This paragraph can be expanded into you know, hours and hours and hours of discussion. It's one of the hugest things that really happens in human history and God history in this entire franchise. So I'll have to hold myself back a little bit. I do find it funny how they managed to condense it all into a simple point of the issue of humanity's magic use. You know, this whole conflict is down to that. It's a very brief description the devs have given here, and that's quite advantageous to them as well, because in truth, specific motivations, Abaddon's motivations, the gods' motivations, and how they felt about giving magic to the humans, and the humans started warring with them and stuff, that's all still pretty shady to this day. All these theories, was Abaddon a good guy or not, kind of all stems from this area of lore discussion. But moving on, I really like that this paragraph suggests something else as well, and it's kind of new information here. There's a suggestion in this that the sea dried up because of the conflict itself. Let's re-listen to this. Their victory is a costly one. The fury of this divine clash obliterates the Crystal Sea, transforming it into the wasteland. So that's suggestive of the thought that this actually dried up because of the battle, like massive explosions and energy belts and things drying it up and sending the magic everywhere, which is a really glorious image I have in my head right now. But it's not what up until now I had really thought was going on here in this area of the lore. What I thought had happened was that Abaddon had been defeated, the fight was over, and the sea was still there. But once Abaddon was imprisoned and his influence over the realm of Tyria waned, that's when the sea dried up. And you might say, well, why is that possible, Wood and Potatoes? It's because Abaddon was the god of water, and the Marganites, his favored people, lived on water. They were puritanical corsair-like people. And so maybe the Crystal Sea only existed through Abaddon's exertion and force of will and show of his strength as the patron god of water. So when he's imprisoned, he can no longer affect the top of Tyria anymore, and so it dries up after that. That was what I had always believed that had happened, but instead we seem to hear that it was in this fight. I'm not sure which I prefer. They're both cool ideas. Maybe we can say it's a bit of both. But yeah, so that's a bit of new clarification on exactly what it was that destroyed the sea. We also hear about the Forgotten. They're described as snake-like. They've actually had a lot of influence on the Guild Wars 2 plot lately. Starting with Season 2, we started to see a lot of stuff based on the Forgotten. In Heart of Thorns, the most recent expansion, we went to a golden city named Tyria, and all over Tyria were interesting lore, tidbits, and pieces of information that teach you about the Forgotten. If you guys haven't completed the achievement where you explore Tyria and read all of that lore, I'd really recommend you go and do it, because it's a lot of fun, and it will teach you about these snake-like people that haven't physically appeared in Guild Wars 2 yet, but have had major impact on the story. They have helped Glint to orchestrate her big plan to get Aurene on the scene, and a lot of what's been happening in the most recent of story. I am really expecting in Path of Fire more details on the Forgotten and what they've been doing. So the other interesting thing about the Forgotten is the last place we knew them to exist was the Crystal Desert. And so the question of where they are now, what happened in the last 250 years to make them completely forgotten, maybe we'll get those answers. Cool lore upcoming? I should hope so. Next bit of the timeline. We're another 450 years in the future now. So the sea dries up, the god is imprisoned, and now we're 450 years forward. It's still the reign of the primeval kings during this time. Elona during all of this time is unified, it's in a heyday, it's a golden era. and it's still all going good. But in 450 years later, this happens. There's a nasty bug going around, the devs say. I kind of hate this subject header because this lore is really cool and it's very dark, and they describe it in a very weird way. So the devs say this: the Scarab Plague, a terrifying disease that horrifically kills its victims, spreads across the region. The primeval monarchs at this time, twin sisters Nala and Dala, are woefully unprepared for the pandemic and fail to stop it from devastating their kingdom. Though the plague subsided in the year 456 after the Exodus, the suffering it causes ends the primeval dynasty, kicking off nearly 200 years of civil war, pretender kings, and lawlessness. So the Scarab Plague is mentioned here. The Scarab Plague is one of my favourite set pieces in the history of Elona. It's very dark. I often talk about a tonal difference and tonal shift in how lighthearted Guild Wars 1 was versus how lighthearted Guild Wars 2 is, but Guild Wars 2 feels a lot more sort of adolescent and cartoony and silly and kiddie. Guild Wars 1 had some pretty dark stuff in it, the Scarab Plague being one. Here I will read you guys from a Guild Wars 1 quest. We get to read a diary of a man who was alive all this time ago. We're still in deep history right now, but he was alive during the primeval king days when the twin sisters Nala and Dala were ruling over the lands and the Scarab Plague has hit. And he's at a massive city. He's actually at the first city, Farron of the first city, all these years ago. And in his diary, this man writes this. He says, "The plague is tearing the city apart. It seems to strike without any sort of logic. Young and old alike are devastated by its effects. Those who still survive burn down entire buildings in hopes of cleansing the plague's dire corruption. But it seems hopeless. Word has reached me of a terrible new stage of the plague, and people are claiming that bugs escape from within their boils. I hope that these are only delusions brought on by the plague's effects, but I'm beginning to wonder if it could be true." And as you read this man's diary throughout these quests, you find out basically it is, and they set up all these quarantines, because these are smart people, learned people. They set up quarantines, but the quarantines fail, and the entire nation is just destroyed, okay? And so, as the devs say, this kicks off nearly 200 years of civil war, pretender kings, and lawlessness. So what that is the Shattered Dynasty era, which is an era that we really know very little about. So let's go on with the timeline. 200 years later, 640 after the Exodus, regrouped, restored, and ready to move forward. After enduring 2 centuries of lesser kings and brutal warlords, the independent states of Korna, Istan, and Vabi joined forces to form a new nation, Elona, named for the great Ellen River that flows through their shared kingdom. This alliance stabilizes the region politically and martially, allowing Elona to heal and finally begin to restore and reclaim its former glory. So this era here, the sort of chaotic era, we know very little about that. It's never been well referenced in Guild Wars 1, in-game, or through external sources. Here's some of the only other information that's cool about it that I know. This is a quote from the Guild Wars Nightfall manuscripts in 2007. "The Shattered Dynasty era was a time when holy warriors roamed the countryside, learning the chants and prayers of the first few dervishes to drive back the darkness. Paragons speak of a time when gods chose them as the select few, champions who would fight in conflicts more vital than the petty struggles of warring defenders." What you guys should understand, and this passage I just read you kind of hints at it a little bit. In 2007, when we got Nightfall, a lot of the information and a lot of the lore we got of that region of the world, it pushed an angle and a suggestion that the people of Elona, the people of the land of the Golden Sun, these people were very in tune with the gods. They were very close to the gods there, and they were very entwined with them. And we never had any explicit reasoning why that was so, but it was kind of a big part of the setting. And so it makes a lot of sense then in Guild Wars 2, when we move into a territory where the gods are returning to Tyria, to pair that with Elona, because Elona was a great region for all of that stuff. And it's obvious why as developers they went for that leaning, because the Nightfall story itself was all about the return of a fallen god, Abaddon, back then. And now 10 years later, we've got the return of a fallen gods, but this time it's Balthazar, and sort of a similar region of the world. So it's pretty cool. Moving on, we have the year 757 AE, and so this is after people have been reunified after the Shattered Dynasty era. A new threat rises that just won't die. And so now we're getting into, finally, a little bit more recent history for Guild Wars 1 terms. You know the difference between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2? Well, now we're at a period of time that's kind of the same. Guild Wars 1, but rewinding 250 years-ish, okay? So a new threat rises that just won't die. Undead Lich Palawa Joko emerges, intent on ruling Alona through magic, fear, and an army of mummies. He builds his bone palace, from which he will launch attacks against his neighbours as he conducts his war of conquest. By the year 860 after the Exodus, Joko has actually taken control of Vabi, earning him the nickname the Scourge of Vabi. So the devs skip over a lot of information here just because we've never heard it as a player base yet. Where did Palawa come from? Why did his vendetta, what brew his vendetta? Why did he decide he wanted to take over Vabi? What spurred him to creating the Bone Palace? None of these things we really know, but this is about 250 years before Guild Wars 1 launched. And remember, Palawa is an undying lich, so things like aging don't matter to him. Therefore, over 100 years later, in the year 860 after the Exodus, we have this, a duel for the ages. Alona joins together to resist Joko's advance. The war culminates in the Battle of Jahai, where Joko and the Alonian hero Churai Ossa square off in single combat, with the combined forces of both sides bearing witness. Ossa prevails, but Joko is not so easily dispatched. How do you kill a threat that's already dead? Ossa's answer, bury it under a rock so big it will never dig its way out. I hate the way they're describing this story. This story is so epic. Okay, so finally, what I just described to you guys is something we've actually been able to play in one of the games. All of this other stuff is just backstory and setting, right? What you actually heard there, this big square off on a bridge and where everyone's watching, that was playable in Guild Wars 1 if you bought something called the bonus mission pack, where you got to actually take control of Churai Ossa himself and experience those events firsthand. So that's the first actual gameplay that we get to see here. But this story of what happened after Palawa died is very interesting. What do you do? Because he just keeps coming back. He won't die. So what the hero Churai Ossa did, and the Alolan people of that time, they imprisoned him, much like how Abaddon was imprisoned, really. They couldn't get rid of him. So not only did they imprison him, but they also established another new order to the world. Not the Order of the Sun Spears, but the Order of Whispers. So yes, the faction you can join in Guild Wars 2, Order of Whispers, this is their origins, here in Alona. They were initially sort of more demon hunters, and they were protecting Palawa's tomb, and then they expanded their influence and the kind of things that they did. That is the beginning of the Order of Whispers, founded by Churai Ossa and Sunspears and Cornins and so forth that had just managed to defeat Palawa, and their entire purpose was keeping Palawa sealed away, a purpose they would ultimately fail in, which we will get to in just a second. So, the year 1075 AE, 1,000 years after the Crystal Desert had formed, 1,000 years after the empires that had founded there to watch over the Mouth of Torment and the place that Abaddon had been cast down, 1,000 years after those empires had receded and so forth, we are now at Nightfall. This is what we played in 2007, the year 1075 after the Exodus. The devs describe it as such. The events of Guild Wars 1 Nightfall take place. After centuries of preparation and manipulation from within his hellish prison, Abaddon makes his move, determined to break out and establish dominion over humanity and the world it inhabits. So yeah, that's the story of 2007 Guild Wars Nightfall. I love how quickly and briefly they describe it. It's sort of like, when you look at this timeline, each paragraph, each block of text could have been a game in its own right, you know? And this was the game that we just so happened to get. To stop Abaddon, players are forced into a devil's bargain with Palawa Joko, the only one who knows how to safely traverse the most dangerous part of the Crystal Desert and take the fight to Abaddon. The cost of this information is Joko's release from beneath his mountainous tomb. So, this is obviously an important block of text because it's serious backstory on one of the main antagonists of Path of Fire, Palawa Joko, how, he came to be where he is in Guild Wars 2. But unfortunately, this article is just straight up wrong here. They say that the cost of this information is Joko's release from beneath his mountainous tomb. That's not correct. So, what actually happened here was Abaddon, in his struggles to break free from his prison, kind of was weakening the boundary and the barrier between Tyria and the Mist. And a consequence of Abaddon's struggle to free himself meant that Palawa Joko was able to free himself too. So Palawa kind of got free not because of us. Palawa is not free because we made a devil's bargain with him and we said, we'll free you if you tell us how to traverse the Crystal Desert and kill Abaddon. That never happened. Palawa was free on his own. What did happen was that once Palawa was free, he had no forces left, no dominion, no control, and we helped him re-establish control and get his forces back and reclaim his undead armies and commanders. We helped him in those endeavors in exchange for information about the Jinundu. So that might seem petty, but I do think it's an important distinction that what the player character did in Guild Wars 1 was not free this Lich, but simply accelerated his potentially inevitable rise to power once again. That's what we did. We helped him reclaim some of his power rather than, you know, making a conscious decision, let's make him free. It was just Abaddon messing up reality that enabled Joko to get free. And no matter what way I look at what the devs have written here, they're wrong on the website. The passage goes on. Let's stop being nerds that think we know better. It says, after a titanic struggle, Abaddon is defeated and his power is absorbed by Cormyr, a Sunspear Spear Marshal. Cormyr ascends to godhood, and she replaces Abaddon as one of the 6 gods, becoming the more benevolent goddess of truth. Because Abaddon was god of water and secrets, she became water and truth, and then even gave water up a little bit later. So there you go, that's Nightfall. That's how we got Cormyr. Cormyr, who is now sincerely worshipped in that region of the world. Because this was now, from Guild Wars 2's term, still 250 years ago. So now we start getting into sort of new territory. The year 1175 after the Exodus, the Scourge returns to Scourge again. Free, and having had 3 centuries to reconsider his strategy while he was in prison, Joko begins a new campaign of conquest. He forgoes brute force in favour of diabolical subtlety, and he diverts the Elen River's life-giving water away from Vabi and the other Elonian states. So that's huge, by the way. If you look at the world map on Guild Wars 2 here, you will see that the Elen River, and by the way, you can see the Elen River in the Straits of Devastation in 2012 right now. You can install Guild Wars 2 and go and see the Elen River right now, or what they call the Elen Sea, which is near the Elen River. This only exists because Palawa created a massive dam, a dam that we will probably be able to visit in the expansion. He created this dam and he starved them all of their water. Deprived of this essential resource, Vabi soon has no choice but to surrender. So Vabi is the first to fall again. Remember, this had happened before. Korna and Istan follow suit, becoming vassal states in King Joko's desert empire. Joko moves to consolidate his hold on the region and to root out his enemies without interference from the rest of the world by closing the region's borders and turning his considerable influence and power inward on his own subjects in his own territory. He kills or converts the Sunspears along with anyone else who dares to oppose his rule until there is no one left with the strength to defy him. So the Sunspears are utterly shattered and broken now. If in the expansion you play as a warrior and you play the Spellbreaker elite specialization, you are kind of the remnants of the Sunspears. The rest of the Sunspears, the converted ones by Palawa, have an interesting story of their own, and they're kind of like totally shattered. And that's really major. Think about how early in the timeline the Sunspears were established and how much good they did, and how it was a Sunspear Spear Marshal that became a god and so forth. And Palawa has just annihilated them. So yeah, really major stuff, and Palawa's taken control. The Order of Whispers too may have been broken or shattered or changed. We now see they're called the Order of Shadows in that region of the world. Who knows why? The Order of Whispers we meet in Kryta and so forth. They are suggested to have some connection with their southern contacts, but never give us any suggestion as to what they actually know or the real state of things. And I hope that the expansion goes into those details too. So, what we just heard a second ago, though, guys, that big block of text about the damming and stuff, that we actually already knew. That was information that we got in 2012, or even earlier than that, sorry, in like 2009, in a PC Gamer article called The Movement of the World, which described all of Guild Wars 2's lore. That was the movement of the world there. The next couple of blocks of text as we wind down this video, this is all totally new stuff, really fresh stuff, super contemporary story. So now, going forward to the year 1320 after the Exodus, an elder dragon moves in. So this is actually what we're about to hear is depicted in one of the novels, the second novel. And here, at last, we get to stories that Guild Wars 2 care about, and Guild Wars 2 has already been about, which have had no relevance to any of this so far. That's how much history there is, the elder dragons. So, Kraukatoric, the crystal elder dragon, wakes from its slumber and heads directly for the desert region, leaving a corrupted swathe of branded landscape and creatures in its wake. Kraukatoric is determined to kill its rebellious champion Glint, but when it reaches her, it finds the guild of heroes known as Destiny's Edge waiting. Destiny's Edge comes very close to stopping Kraukatoric, but their effort ultimately fails. And all of this, as I said, is depicted in great detail in one of the novels. Kraukatoric kills Glint, along with her forgotten attendants and Snaff, a founding member of Destiny's Edge. This defeat leads the guild to disband, and Kraukatoric goes unchallenged as it settles into the desert region and prepares to consume as much of the world's magic as it can. So that is what really the status quo was in 2012 as we finally start to play Guild Wars 2. Snaff had died. They give the extra detail here that Glint's Forgotten are killed. The devs suggesting that this is what wiped the Forgotten out. They were wiped out by Kraukatoric, because honestly, that's not really depicted in the novel, and that hadn't been talked about, so that could be new lore right there. And maybe that's the story they're going to be giving us once Path of Fire is out. They'll be explicit about that. Maybe there'll be some Forgotten left alive. I would hope so. And especially in the Mist, there should be some Forgotten. But anyway, I digress. Next, we have 1328 AE, and this is the date of the most recent expansion, guys. One dragon's loss is another dragon's gain. Heroes kill the jungle elder dragon Morgemoth in the very distant Maguma jungle. After absorbing a portion of the magic released by Morgemoth's demise, Kraukatoric rises from its lair in the Crystal Desert and heads south towards the more populated areas of the Elonian region. So, very recently in Guild Wars 2, we had an update where the world map changed. And on the changed world map, we all noticed that the brand had moved. The scar had gone even further south. And so that demonstrated that Kraukatoric at some point had moved. I'm kind of disappointed that at no point in Living World Season 3 and at no point at the end of Heart of Thorns in a cutscene or anything did the devs ever talk about this movement, because you'd think there would be something that they should have filtered in. It kind of gives the impression that the devs have only recently decided they wanted that lore to be a thing, and I hate that thought. I hate that they're flying by the seat of their pants like that. Let's just hope that it was because they didn't have the scope or the time to give it to us until now, when randomly the world map had changed and we get this little bit of text on a friggin' website. Moving on, we have this year, Path of Fire, 1329. Lighting the fuse. Balthazar, the god of fire and war, returns to Tyria to kill an elder dragon and claim its power, despite knowing that doing so will plunge the world's magic into permanent chaos. He acquires enough power to accomplish this daunting task, but the players thwart his attempts to destroy Primordus and Jormag. With only one viable target left, Balthazar sets his sights on Kraukatoric in the desert. Which brings us to the present day. Kraukatoric is at the peak of its power, Balthazar is obsessed with claiming that power for himself, and they're headed for a showdown in Joko's Desert Kingdom. The potential clash between these three formidable forces threatens not only the Elonian Desert, but the entire world. Even with your help, can the desert region and its people survive? Or will over 1,000 years of culture and history disappear like grains of sand in the wind? Only time and Guild Wars 2 Path of Fire will tell. And there you go, that's the expansion, that's the story, that's what rolls into what we are currently experiencing. And there is so much juicy stuff floating around all at once. There's a lot to get into, isn't there? There'll be more videos of mine coming up very soon, guys, where I give you tours of the Guild Wars 1 versions of the Crystal Desert and regions of Elona, as well as I want to give you a production on all the major set pieces of story I would expect to return in this expansion and how I would like them to be explored by the expansion. So those will be similar videos to this one. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks very much for watching. If this has made you a bit more excited about the expansion, I'm very glad. I have a link to pick it up in the description if you guys would like it, check it out. Don't be scared to link this to anyone who doesn't know whether they're really interested and feels a bit out of the loop. Hopefully they'll feel a bit more in the loop by this point. And as always, drop some comments if you've got questions and further clarifications you'd like. I'll be more than happy to go into that with you there. Cheers everybody. I'll see you very shortly for the next video. Thanks for watching.